right before Lindsay and I moved last fall, we kind of realized as we began to pack things and get things organized to get ready to move to our new house, that we had accrued quite a bit of clutter over the several years that we lived in that house. I don't know if anyone has ever experienced that before, as you're getting ready to pack, as you're getting ready to kind of set things up, you realize, like, we still have this? Like, we don't use this in 5 years. Why do we still have this? And so it began this kind of giant game of keep it or sell it. And Lindsay and I tend to kind of fall on opposite ends of that spectrum. You learn a lot about yourself and about your spouse when you move. One of the things I learned about myself is that I am a sentimentalist that borders on hoarding, and my wife is a minimalist that borders on being dead inside. And so we just go back and forth of like, no, you can't get rid of that. Like, that was from when we went to that one place and like, oh, that was so great. She's like, yeah, but that was like 6 years ago. Like, we've never used it. I didn't even know we still had it. It's like, no, we need to get rid of it. And I'm just like, and then I'm dying inside because she's wanting to get rid of all the stuff that I want to keep. And so, you know, all the stuff you accrue over 10 years of marriage, for me anyway, it can be kind of hard to get rid of some of that stuff, but we realized, okay, like, we're going to have a garage sale, we're going to give some stuff away. Like, we realized we needed to simplify our lives a little bit because we were moving to a smaller space, and it just really forced us in a lot of ways to focus on what really mattered. So in the midst of all this, we had a lot of really good conversations about what we need versus what we want. And a lot of times we use the word need when we really need to use the word want. And those types of things can kind of conflict with each other sometimes. And have you ever dealt with that before? You feel like you need something, but it turns out that you really just want it. And we sometimes use those words interchangeably, and we don't realize what is actually necessary in our lives. And our lives can then get a little cluttered, a little overcomplicated. Have you ever felt like you've been in a place where you just feel like your life is just scattering in like 10 different directions at once? That you're always pursuing something that's bigger and better, but then you find yourself walking away unsatisfied. I mean, most of us we're constantly buying the newest phone or the biggest TV or the next, edition of a car or the newest style of clothes, only to have a garage sale and sell many of those things a year or two later, those things that we needed, that we had to have, and then a year or so later, we're getting rid of them. How many of you are involved with so many countless activities right now that you feel like you're like in this like massive juggling act where you have all these balls in the air and you find yourself asleep at night sometimes wondering, like, is something going to drop? Like, if I keep at this pace, is something eventually going to drop and it's going to hurt somebody? I was reading an article about a report that came out. It's actually an annual report that always comes out in the spring that is done in conjunction with the several prominent American universities, I think a British university, and the Gallup organization. And what they do is they put out this report every year of the top happiest countries in the world. Real fascinating study. They use data around things like income, healthy life expectancy, social support, freedom, lack of corruption, and generosity to determine the overall relative happiness of countries in the world. Sounds kind of cool, right? Interesting thing to see what the happiest countries are in the world. So I started kind of perusing through this study, thinking like, I feel like I have a pretty happy life. Like, I wonder where the United States rates in this, because it seems like we have everything we could ever want and need. So I wonder where we rate with that. And I was shocked to see that the United States did not even rate in the top 10 in the study. In fact, in the 2017 study, the United States ranked number 18 of the happiest nations in the world. There were 17 other countries that overall were happier in general. In fact, the United States was actually 4 spots lower on the rating than they were the year before. So it shows that the trend is actually going in the opposite direction. I found myself thinking, like, how is it that, us, one of the richest, most affluent, most innovative and productive countries in the world, like, we're barely in the top 20 happiest nations in the world? And the reasons given, some of the reasons given for such a low rating was they actually stated that it was because of ongoing epidemics of obesity, substance abuse, and untreated depression. And we see all these things running rampant in our culture. We are one of the most rich, most affluent, advanced societies in the world, and yet we are increasingly miserable. Nations like Finland and Norway, much smaller, much less affluent, sometimes much less advanced technologically, scored incredibly higher in many of these categories than U.S. statistics. And you think, like, how can a country that has so much be so miserable? Is it possible that maybe having more and gaining and increasing doesn't always equate to better? See, I think the answer to these questions are a little bit more simple than we realize. And so this is actually why we're doing this series. We're starting a series today that we're going to do through the month of September called The Simple Life. And we're looking at these things, these practices that, like, when we look in the Bible, we believe that a certain type of life is talked about when the kingdom of God is talked about, that Jesus called us to live a particular type of life, to exist in a particular type of way in this world, and it's called the simple life. Now, when I say simple, sometimes we hear that word and we think it means some things that it doesn't necessarily biblically mean. What I mean by simple is that it is not a complicated life, not a confusing, not a fragmented life, but that everything is focused and pointed intentionally at the things that matter most in our lives, that we're not just kind of living aimlessly, going from one thing to another. Would you say that you live a pretty simple life? Is your energy and your focus only going towards several meaningful things, or are you fragmented in a million different directions? What would it take to unfragment, to uncomplicate your life, to be able to focus on what really matters? Because the reason why this is so important is simplicity is talked about as kind of cultivating the great art of letting go. Simplicity is focusing on loosening unhealthy attachments to owning and having and achieving. See, simplicity is meant to bring freedom, and with freedom comes generosity. Now, quick word on what simplicity is not, and this is really, really important because oftentimes this gets talked about in all kinds of wrong ways. Simplicity does not mean that you're taking a vow of poverty and giving everything away. There are times where Jesus called people to do that, to address something going on in their heart. But somehow we have begun to, when we talk about simplicity and things like that, we somehow equate poverty with righteousness, and somehow it's evil to own things. Many people hear that term and they think simplicity means that I have to become some sort of hermit who lives in the mountains and lives in a hut and makes their clothes out of recycled garbage, or I don't know. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. Richard Foster, who is an author, expert on spiritual growth, spiritual disciplines, actually wrote an entire book on simplicity, and it's one of the most fantastic books I've ever read. And this is how he talks about it in his book. He says, simplicity is an inward reality that results in an outward lifestyle. Forced poverty is evil and should be renounced, nor does the Bible condone an extreme asceticism. Asceticism is the belief that you have to deny any good thing in your life, that you can have no good things. You have to almost, in a sense, punish yourself spiritually and physically. He says asceticism renounces possessions. Simplicity sets possessions in proper perspective. Simplicity is the only thing that sufficiently reorients our lives so that possessions can be genuinely enjoyed without destroying us. Simplicity sets us free to receive the provision of God as a gift that is not ours to keep and can freely be shared with others. See, what we do with our time and our possessions and our attention has much less to do with how much we make or how big our house is, and has much more to do with where our focus lies. In fact, Jesus said it best in Matthew 5:21, when he kind of, in a sense, diagnoses a chief condition of humanity when he says this. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." We often quote that wrong and say that we think it's like, oh, where your heart is, there your treasure will be. You're going to invest in the thing that you care about. But no, he says where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He gives this warning shot kind of across the bow of our lives so that we sit up and take heed that whatever you value the most, your heart, all of your time, all of your energy, all of your focus will run after that thing. If your treasure is your stuff, then you will just full throttle pursue that American dream and kill yourself doing it. Because that is the one thing that matters, is to accrue and gain and get as much as possible. If it's your time, if that's your treasure, then you will selfishly guard your schedule and never allow anything to interrupt it or never allow anything to change it, because that is your idol in your life. See, in our culture, we run a million different directions to protect whatever we consider to be our treasure. But see, what if I were to tell you that the Bible was actually really clear about what the simple life was supposed to look like? What if I told you that Jesus already prescribed in many ways what it means to live a simple life in the kingdom? What if discussions about simplifying our lives doesn't start with talking about your money or talking about your time or anything else, but rather starts with talking about your heart? What if we've already been given direction to where our focus should be, our time and our energy and our things? Because he has, and we do. And there's a story that I want to look at. It's an interesting conversation Jesus has with two women. And very interesting story, because these women end up being faced with a very interesting choice where they find that what is expected suddenly comes in on a collision course with what is needed. And it leaves them with a choice on how they're going to live their lives from then on. We're going to be in Luke chapter 10, in verse 38. So if you have your Bible and you want to turn to it and follow with me, you're welcome to do that. It will also be on the screen. Luke 10:38. It says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened the home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work for myself? Tell her to help me. Okay, so quick rundown on the situation. Jesus and his disciples come to this little town that is just outside of Jerusalem called Bethany. And they're going to visit a family that apparently Jesus had some sort of a relationship with, had some sort of a friendship with, because they keep showing up multiple times throughout the gospel. There were two sisters, Mary and Martha. And then we find out in one of the gospels that there was actually a brother named Lazarus. That in the Gospel of John, we find out Jesus actually raises him from the dead. He gets sick and passes away, and Jesus raises him from the dead. We're not sure whether sometimes the timing of these stories, we're not sure whether that happened prior to this story or after it. But this is the family. So anyway, sets up the stage. Jesus and his 12 disciples are coming to visit this family, and a little bit of conflict ensues, because then Martha becomes angry because in the midst of all the hospitality preparations and food and all those types of things, she realizes, my sister's not helping me. I'm the only one getting this ready, that there are 13 people or more out there talking about whatever, and I'm back here slaving myself. So she gets all mad, and she struts out and says to Jesus, and she finds her sister sitting out there listening to Jesus teach. And so she gets mad, tell him, you have authority apparently, why don't you tell my sister to help me? Now, oftentimes we hear this story and we think okay, Martha's the one that's all work, and Mary's just hey, let's chill out. It's come on, Martha, why don't you just chill out and go with the flow and just kind of relax a little bit. That's normally how we hear this story and think. But I want you to see the story through the lens of not only Martha, but through the lens of the culture that they were all in. See, this famous rabbi was coming to this house with his 12 disciples, because I started to think through, okay, if I spontaneously dropped it on my wife that 13 people were going to be coming over and she wasn't ready for it, there'd be a little bit of stress. be freaking out a little bit. Like we're not, we don't just always have that type of thing ready. So it's like, yeah, gosh, 13 people coming over and you're not ready for it. Yeah, there's a little frantic kind of getting ready type of thing. But then on top of that, those who would normally help are not willing to help. So that kind of compounds it even more. But probably one of the things that puts this the most in perspective is understanding the role of hospitality in the ancient world. See, this wasn't, like I said, with our family, like if that happened, we're freaking out because we just like feel like we're not prepared. But the thing is, in our culture, my honor, my reputation, my integrity are not wrapped up in whether I have chips and salsa ready for this group of people coming over. But that's the way it was in the ancient world. Hospitality was this like holy, sacred thing. And in many ways in the Middle East, it still is. It still is treated as this holy thing. Very, very highly regarded, important thing to receive someone into your home. That it reflected on your reputation. It reflected on your, even on your character. Like for someone who is unwilling to be hospitable to someone, people would question your character, that you are somehow unrighteous because you're unwilling to invite someone into your home. So all of this is kind of floating in the background. It's like basically you're going to make this holy rabbi who's doing all these kind of crazy things for God, you're going to make him think poorly of us by not helping me out. So, freaking out. So I want you to know and understand that Martha's frustration was understandable. Like it was realistic. It was common. Like she felt the pressure of her culture to live and act and behave in a certain way. And don't we have similar things in our own culture of cultural expectations of what we should buy, what we should spend, how big our house is, certain things that almost reflect like what's wrong with you if you're not going with that cultural flow. Like even thinking about the hospitality thing, like I think about like my own life. Like I remember when Lindsay and I were first married, and someone would be coming over, to the house or something. Or I may even mention offhandedly, like, hey, so-and-so's going to stop by. They're going to pick up this or that. And my wife just like starts freaking out. And she's like picking up stuff and like so weird. I'm like, nobody cares. Like it doesn't matter. But she's like, I care. Like she's picking everything up. But of course now we have kids. And so is it just me, or do I feel like our entire house is coated with a fine film of cracker crumbs? Just like everywhere. Like anywhere I go sit, I just like sit down, it's like crumb. They don't even go in this room. Like how did crumbs get in? It's like they're like floating in the atmosphere and they just like settle like dust everywhere. And so now it's to the point where it's like, oh, people are coming? Okay, make a path. Make a path. And then when people come in, it's like almost like an excuse. As soon as they walk in, we're like, well, we have kids. It's like we just want them to know. Just so you know why we've got kids. Now, of course, for young people who come over who also have young kids too, they're all like, oh yeah, solidarity, like totally. Like my house is exactly like this. Like it's okay. So there's a little bit of grace among the young family. So thank you for those of you who have shown us grace in the wreck that is our house sometimes. But that's a reality of it. There's pressure that can come around that, especially when what is expected begins to kind of get into collision with what we feel like is needed. But I want you to hear Jesus' response to Martha. Because in the midst of this, it's talking about how she was becoming distracted with all the preparations that had to be made. She was, and this is how Jesus replies. He says, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things. How many of you are worried and upset about many things right now? I can think of a few things I could be worried and upset about. You are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed, only one. There's only one thing that's really needed. Mary has chosen, key word there, has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. Only one thing is needed, and it won't be taken. What a powerful statement. See, the truth is, we live in a world where it is so easy to be worried and upset about many things. And the truth is, many of you brought those things with you here today. And I can't think of a better place to bring them, but you still brought them. For some of you, you brought burdens that are financial, that you've been working and plowing away, just trying to get out of debt or trying to deal with some sort of financial issue, find a better job or whatever, and you just can't quite seem to make any headway. It just seems like it's a, 2 steps forward, 1 step back type of thing. Maybe you're going through some kind of relationship thing. Maybe there's tension, there's unforgiveness with a spouse, or there's issues with your kids. Maybe some of you are having to watch your children. They're now at an age where you have to watch them eat the fruit of their decisions, and you have to sit helpless and stand by and watch it happen. And so you're distracted by those things. It's hard for you to really even think about what matters most because you just have this stuff, these problems, these issues floating in the ether in orbit around your life, around your heart, around your soul. Things seem so complicated. Does anybody else feel like their life is just complicated right now? But Jesus speaks to Martha's striving. He speaks to her straining, and he speaks to the issue deep within her soul, cuts past the anxiety to say the one thing that she really needed to hear. Choose what matters. Choose what matters. He says there's a few things that really matter in life, and he's like, and honestly, if you look at those things, they can really be compressed into one thing. There is really one thing that is genuinely needed in life, and we always have to choose that, even if sometimes it seems like it's to our detriment when we choose it. Basically, Jesus is warning Martha, don't trade what matters most for what matters right now. Don't trade, don't neglect what has infinite value for something that only has immediate value. And don't we feel that temptation all the time? That there are these things that are just right in front of me, and it just seems to like color my world, and there's nothing else but this. And Jesus is wanting to say, no, take that off. This is a small thing. It does not matter. There are bigger things you can focus on. You just have to get outside of that to do so. Because the Bible actually has a phrase for the person who does this, who gets focused on the immediate, gets focused on the urgent, can't see beyond what's important right now rather than what's most important. And the word that's used for that is double-minded. That person is double-minded. James, the brother of Jesus, in his letter in the New Testament, actually gives several warnings about the double-minded person. In James 1:8, he warns that the double-minded person is unstable in all their ways, that they are unable to receive what they ask in prayer because their soul is literally fragmented. It says that they're tossed back and forth like a person on the high seas. In James 4:8, he warns the double-minded person to purify their hearts. And it's interesting because this word that we translate as double-minded, the Greek word literally means split-souled. That there's this division, there's this fracture, there's this brokenness within your soul, and it is causing you to desire all these different things, that there is not unity within your being on what is most important, that different fragmented parts of you are pursuing after different things, that your soul has become overcomplicated. And so Jesus warns against this many times in multiple places. In the parable of the sower, one of Jesus' most famous parables, he's talking about how one receives the word of God in their life. And he uses these examples of different types of soil receiving seed. And he says, just like there's and he identifies 4 different types of soil that receive the seed that is sown. In 4 different ways, he says, so it is with the human soul receiving the word of God. And probably the one that honestly in our culture, in our time and day today, that scares me the most is the soil riddled with thorns and weeds. Mark 4:18, Jesus says this, still others, like seeds sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, making it unfruitful. That is our culture. That is our world. worries of this life, deceitfulness of wealth, desires for other things come in and choke the world. That is what it means to be double-minded, that our desires for other things distract us from what matters most. And then we become double-minded, unstable in all of our ways. Like, this is literally what Jesus was talking about in the whole Sermon on the Mount. We read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and 6 and 7, and we think that it's just like a random hodgepodge of stories that Jesus kind of throws out to, give his thoughts on some different things. But there's actually these like unifying elements, these unifying threads throughout that entire sermon. But if we just read them in isolation, each little section, we miss it. That oftentimes we have to read whole sermons, whole chapters, whole books as a whole to see the threads that are woven. Because Jesus warns them in Matthew 5:48. He says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And of course, we hear that and we think he means just like moral perfection. Like, you can never make a mistake, you can never do anything wrong. And of course, we feel the weight of that, and it's like, well, who can do that? Like, that's not even and then we just despair because it's like, well, we don't match up to that. But it's interesting because the word that's used here for perfect, there's several nuances of words, several nuances of meanings. That this word that we translate as perfect can mean whole, complete, mature, or perfect. That we use the word perfect usually only meaning moral perfection, but this word can actually have the nuance of something performing the function for which it was created. So when I say that my lawnmower is working perfectly, I'm not saying it's morally flawless. I'm saying it's doing what it was created to do. And Jesus is saying there's these fractures within your soul because of your sin that is dividing you to become something other than what you were created to be. And so literally the whole Sermon on the Mount, he says things, basically saying that you need to be whole, you need to be complete, that you can't be different on the inside than you are on the outside. And that's why he says, just examples, he says, don't preach against adultery, but then lust after people in your heart. Don't cry out against the injustice of murder when you kill people every day in your heart with your hate. Don't say you trust in God completely while inwardly you worry about every single detail of your life. And don't say that you only love God when in truth you actually kind of love your stuff too. And don't condemn other people for their sin when you've done nothing at all to avoid the exact same things in your own life. In a nutshell, Jesus is saying, stop being double-minded. Stop being split-souled. Your soul has been fractured by your sin, and until you look the same on the inside as you do on the outside, you will not enter the kingdom of God. And of course, we hear that and think, I can't do that on my own. I can't exert enough moral effort to look the same on the inside as I do on the outside. And the whole point of that was Jesus was like, exactly. You need new birth. You need to be born again. You don't need to try harder. That is a gospel of works. He said, you need to surrender to me, trust in me, follow me, and I will heal your fractured soul. I will make you new. I will make you something different than you ever thought you could be. So it's not about try harder, work harder, strain more, exert more moral effort, but instead, die more, surrender, and allow me to transform you. Trust in Jesus and follow him. Look to him, and he will make you into what you were created to be. Like, this is literally the essence of the gospel. This is why Jesus said in Matthew 6:33, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be given to you as well. You're worried about your relationships. You're worried about your finances. You're worried about your job. You're worried about all these things. And yes, there are big things. It's not that Jesus is minimizing them, but he says, but you're looking in the wrong places for solutions. Instead, if you would trust me, if you would look to me, if you would focus on me, I will begin to reorder your life. I will begin to put back the pieces together. In fact, a friend of mine who's a pastor in the nearby area, something he'd always say, this is how he always defined the gospel, and I love this. He said, the gospel is the story that Jesus is putting back together this broken world, including us, and he's not giving up till he's done. I love that. Jesus is putting back together this broken world, including us, and he's not giving up until he's done. That was the whole reason he came, to redeem and restore everything that was broken by sin. Not just us so we can go to heaven, but literally everything, including this world. And so that's the essence of the simple life, is we can run after and choose all these other things, but he says, no, the one thing that matters, the one thing Martha needed to know that Mary already figured out was, if you look to me, if you follow me, if you trust me, all this other stuff will figure itself out. You don't need to worry about it. Now, practically speaking, because I can say that, but practically speaking, what does that look like to keep our focus on Jesus? How do we remove the weeds in our soil so that we're not distracted by the things that don't really matter? Well, truth be told, the answer to a lot of those questions are going to be talked about throughout the series. I don't want to steal the thunder from the other weekends, because we're going to be talking specifically about, our stuff, our things, our possessions, the things that God brings into our lives. Like, how do we appropriately orient ourselves to our stuff so that we have them and they don't have us? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how we spend our time and how that influences the condition of our souls. And there's a lot of great weeks. I want to encourage you, come to every single week of this series, because it's going to be so incredibly practical, so incredibly useful, and so incredibly at the center of what the Christian life looks like. But I don't want to just walk away without some kind of a practical takeaway. So I'll start with this. First off, I believe that simplicity is both an inward condition and an outward discipline. And it's important that we understand both of these. What I mean is, simplicity isn't simply discussion about financial planning or discussion about time management. It is first and foremost about heart management. Like, when I dig deep into the bedrock of making Jesus that one thing, that pearl of great price, that one thing I'm willing and ready to trade everything else for, then practices of simplicity begin to flow out of our lives without us even realizing it. Because if we don't get it, that it's both a heart condition and an outward practice, then we miss the point and we won't be transformed. And I'll give you an example of how when we see the conflict between the heart condition and the practice not being there, I'll show you how that can kind of come about. There's a story years ago, I remember, Tim Maxon, who is actually a missionary that we support here. He was a mentor of mine for a very long time, discipled me for years. He's a missionary in the Middle East now. And I remember a story him telling me long time ago of, like, realizing how sometimes we can do spiritual things without the heart really being behind it. And he was talking about how whenever he was in college, he went on a month-long mission trip to India, Calcutta, India, to be specific, which, if you know anything about India, Calcutta is literally like the armpit of the world. Like, it is just one of the most destitute, impoverished places in the world. And so he went there and he got to work with the Sisters of Mercy, which, if you don't know who they are, the Sisters of Mercy is actually the order that Mother Teresa was a part of. Like, he actually got to meet Mother Teresa and pray with her and talk with her. It was a really awesome opportunity. This was back in the early 90s. And so there's a lot of cool stories around all of that. But one of the things he learned, and I've seen this in myself and I've seen it in other people, that people who go on mission trips for the first time, especially to a third world country, whenever they come back, there's typically like a very knee-jerk reaction that happens, because most of them have never been face to face with that level of poverty. And so when they get back, they're almost disgusted by everything that they have. And so typically the extreme knee-jerk is, I'm just going to get rid of everything. I'm going to get rid of all my stuff and give everything away or sell it, whatever. And so Tim just started getting rid of all of his stuff. He got rid of his bed, so he's sleeping on a mattress on the ground, thinking how dare we live like this when they're living like that over, all that type of stuff. And so one of the things he started to do, because he's I never want any of my stuff to have any kind of hold over me. So he's here's what I want to do. Anytime someone compliments something that I have, I'm going to offer it to them to have and genuinely mean it. And so people will be oh, Tim, I really like your shoes. And he's like, oh, thanks. you want them? Like, you can have them if you want them. Or like, nice jacket or nice TV or whatever. Like, he would offer anything anytime someone would just offhandedly compliment. Now, of course, everybody always said no, because it's kind of a weird thing to say. Like, you want to take off your shirt right now and give it to me? That's kind of creepy. But it's like he'd say that, and of course he's feeling like, yeah, like my possessions don't have a hold on me. Well, over the course of time, 6-8 months later, he ended up buying this like really nice, really expensive mountain bike, where it was made out of the, like, I don't know, carbon fiber stuff or whatever it is, where it's like super light, really expensive. And like it kind of became Tim's baby. Like, he loved this thing. And so his friends, would kind of get annoyed when he'd always do the like, do you want it type of thing. And so they're like, okay, let's see how well this works. And so they're like, hey, Tim, I like your bike. And he's like, huh? Oh man, like, here it is. Am I really going to do it? Am I really going to practice what I preach? And so literally in that moment, like, he's like dying inside as he says it. He's like, do you want it? And the guy's like, yeah, I do. And he's like, no one's ever said that before. I don't know what to do. So he's like, I have to. Like, I've bragged about it. I have to do it. And so he gives him the bike, and the guy keeps it. For like a month, he's like riding it around near him and stuff like that. So like he sees him with it and stuff like that. Now, after a month, he ends up giving it back to him. But he does it to make a point, saying like, when we have these types of things in place, we're doing these disciplines or practices, but the heart of simplicity is not behind it, it's never going to work. Otherwise, it's just self-righteousness, religious pretending, because simplicity has to start with the heart. And so this is how I want to end our time together. Imagine how different our world would be if we only ever just wanted Jesus more than anything else. Can you imagine how different our lives would be if we just knew without a shadow of a doubt that was absolutely true? Imagine what our lives, what our community would be like if we simply refused to trade what we want most in life for what we want right now, that we didn't allow immediate value to trump eternal value. Are your hearts divided in 1,000 different directions right now? Are you being pulled in all kinds of different ways? See, seeking his kingdom and his righteousness is the only way you're ever going to be freed from all the complicated temptations that come in this world. It is the only way that you're ever going to be able to truly simplify your soul. And so this is how I want us to respond today, is I want us to actually be able to take communion together, to end out the service, to actually partake in the Lord's Supper together as one whole community. And here's why. Our team has been having a lot of discussions about why do we gather? Like, why do we have corporate worship together? Like, what is the point of all of us coming together? And there's a lot of different reasons that we come up with, but again, it's about honing in on like what matters the most, what is most important for doing this type of thing. And the answer that we kept coming back to over and over again is this is a time when all of us can come together and remember and celebrate the gospel. The message that the kingdom of God has come into the world finally. It was predicted for thousands of years, and it has finally come into the world through the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus. And now we can be changed. We can enter that kingdom. We can become new creations and live with God for eternity that starts now and stretches on forever. That is the good news. And one of the core ways we remember that is through communion. So I want to actually invite the ushers, if you guys want to come forward and begin to pass out the elements. I just want to say a few words around this first. If you are not a member of New Hope, like if you're just visiting here and you're a follower of Jesus, you are more than welcome to partake in this table with us. Because even if this is not your church home, and you genuinely want to remember and celebrate the gospel with us, you are more than welcome to do that. So you don't have to be a card-carrying member of New Hope to be able to celebrate the gospel here with us. Another thing, there's actually 2 cups stacked on top of each other. One is the bread, one is the juice. Make sure you grab both of those. We want you to be able to partake in the entire Lord's Supper. So make sure you grab that. But what I want to challenge you to do, because I guarantee many of you right now are worried and upset and distracted by many things you're thinking about, what's going to happen this afternoon. You're thinking about what's going to happen tonight. You're thinking about that meeting you have on Monday. You're thinking about that event you have later this week. This is the time to push that all aside and focus on the one thing that matters. Focus on Jesus. Put your trust in him and allow him to simplify your soul. You are free to take communion as you feel led, and then I will come back up at the end and pray to close us out.